A lot of green projects, sustainable projects, impact projects may not be financially attractive to private sector investors. And that's why, at least in the early stage, the government have to come in to incentivize to crowding the private sector money to scale up the impact investing.
Welcome everyone to Impact Investing Musings, a podcast series where we delve into the ever-evolving world of impact investing and aim to connect, educate, and share knowledge to drive capital towards impact. I'm Vikas Arora, Chief of Impact Investing at AVPN.
And I'm Jackie Hocking from Dalbo. In this episode, I discuss with Dr. Jun Ma, one of the world's foremost champions of green finance and sustainable development, with a career spanning 3 decades across China, Hong Kong, and the international stage. Let's dive in.
Hello, my name is Ma Jun. I'm the chairman and president of Hong Kong Green Finance Association. I also chair a global platform for capacity building, which is called CASI. CASI's full name is Capacity Building Alliance of Sustainable Investment. And I'm wearing many other hats in the sustainable finance field, including, chairing the Green Finance Committee in China and co-chairing the China-European-led Common Ground Taxonomy Working Group and many others.
So you've been around and seen a huge evolution in the industry. What are some of the biggest shifts and changes you've seen so far?
Yeah, maybe starting a little bit on the broader sort of green sustainable finance landscape. I started to be involved in 2014 when I joined the Chinese Central Bank, namely the People's Bank of China, as chief economist. And I began to work on the green finance policy within China. 2015-16, I was leading the drafting of the Chinese Green Finance Guideline. And 2015, I was leading the development of a Chinese Green Bond Standard or taxonomy. And these are the early days of China green finance development. Now, after 10 years, China has developed the largest green lending market with outstanding amount of 45 trillion RMB, which is equivalent to about 6 trillion US dollar. So that's part of my sort of China involvement. And globally, I've been involved in a lot of international initiatives, including co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, which developed lots of very important guidelines and principles for sustainable finance growth around the world, including, for example, 2021. The working group came up with this roadmap for sustainable finance. And 2022, the working group developed the transition finance framework for G20. So now these pieces of guidelines and principles are very important in guiding many countries and many organizations in developing their strategy for green sustainable finance work. Of course, impact investing is a topic today, right? We've been talking about that on the podium. And I'd like to maybe translate a little bit of the global sustainable finance framework into or mapping to the impact investing world. Now, within the framework, I often say we need 4 pillars. Number one, we need to define sustainable activities clearly so that we can avoid greenwashing, transition washing, impact washing, and so on. Now, on that part, I think the green taxonomy is doing a good job. China has a green finance taxonomy defining these as a green activity. For example, solar, wind, other renewable energy, electric vehicles, batteries, solid waste treatment, water treatment, and so on. It's a big table, and it used to be 10 pages. As I was leading the drafting of the first version 10 years ago. Now it's 100-something pages. Yeah. And Europe has taxonomy, a few hundred pages. And I heard 40-something country have taxonomy for green finance. But I have not heard that there's an impact investing taxonomy yet, officially, right? Maybe some private sector-led, NGOs and associations been developing that, but there's no well-recognized impact investing definition. And that's one key bottleneck which we should overcome. And the second point or pillar in the sustainable finance ecosystem is the disclosure requirement. Now, within green finance or sustainable finance, there are global standards now. For example, ISSB, which sets out the framework for disclosure of sustainability related information, especially carbon related information. And a lot of countries are adopting these. For example, in Asia, I think 14 economies have either adopted or decide to adopt ISSB as a disclosure standard. But again, if we translate that into impact investing, how do we disclose impact-related indicators, right? For example, employment generation, poverty reduction, and so on and so forth. There's no universally agreed set of measures. And these indicators or measurements are not mandatory applied to impact investing participants, right? And that's another bottleneck we need to overcome. The third pillar is the financial products. Within the green finance field, we have green loans, green bonds, ETF and the ABS, carbon markets, and all of these. And in the impact world, now, of course, I think a lot of equity, related instruments like PE and VC, angel investments, and so on. But of course, they need to bring in, debt investors as well, right? And maybe some, risk mitigation instruments and so on. So we need to have a combination of financial instruments that facilitate the development of impact projects. That's pillar 3. And the last one is probably most important, is about incentive. A lot of green projects, sustainable projects, impact projects may not be financially viable or financially attractive to private sector investors. And that's why, at least in the early stage, the government have to come in to incentivize to crowding the private sector money. So within green finance space, I actually give 2 examples of how regulators in China and Hungary have been working on this incentive. For example, the Chinese central bank has introduced what we call decarbonization facility, which is a funding facility through a commercial bank to green projects such as renewables. And they offer low funding costs relative to markets. And in Hungary, the Central Bank of Hungary introduced what they called capital relief program, which essentially reduces risk weighting for green assets and thereby reducing funding costs for green lending. So all these are help to the private sector, to reduce their funding costs for green projects, right? But in impact investing, I have not heard much the government subsidizing impact investing or giving tax credit, tax exemption, or offering low-cost funding. That's not happening, at least on a large scale. So I think that's the 4th pillar, which we need to address going forward, really to scale up the impact investing capacity.
So when you're pushing for taxonomy or a new framework to be adopted, one thing you need is consensus. When you're dealing with such diverse stakeholders, how do you actually bring people into alignment? What's proven most effective for you?
In this field, I think the combination of top-down and the bottoms-up approach is necessary. Now, so far, what I see on impact investment is largely bottoms-up. It's all kind of NGOs, associations, philanthropies, and some private investors. They have passion, right, for investing in this area. But the governments are not responding that much. And one of the problems is that in many countries, there's no government clear definition, of that role within the government structure. For example, in the green finance field, we know, a lot of countries have a central bank designated to do green taxonomy, to design green finance policies, and so on. So somebody is responsible for that. But who is responsible in the government for impact investing? Nobody knows. Yeah, and we need to find that, agency. Maybe, the NGOs should propose to the government that this particular agency should be given a task, right, to coordinate the policies and standards, disclosure requirements on impact investing. And then they will issue what I call authoritative documents on definition, on disclosure requirements. And that will apply across the market. Now, if you do this only on the bottoms-up approach, which means that in a country you got 100 NGOs proposing standards, proposing disclosure requirements, and each compete with each other, my standard is better than yours, and they can't agree. It may take years and decades to agree on something, right, within the country. That slows down the process.
So what is the trick then to be able to unlock true collaboration? Have you witnessed this?
I have not seen much of success in the impact investing world in terms of consensus building, led by regulator. But in the green finance field, definitely, yes. The Chinese central bank is a good example. Back 10 years ago, the PBOC took the leadership on developing taxonomy and developing disclosure requirements, developing policy incentive, and so on. And PBOC organized these other 7 ministries because we know that the other ministries are also, important, contributors to the policy framework. But someone has to take a lead.
Yeah, leadership is certainly a critical need in the sector, especially when it comes to disclosures. We've seen the pendulum swing between mandatory and voluntary reporting in this part of the world. Looking ahead, what do you foresee for Asia? Are we moving towards more mandatory reporting?
I think it should be simple and mandatory. Yeah, if it's very complex, of course, it won't be executed well. Even if it's mandatory, the capability is not there, cost is too high. And if it's not mandatory, not very useful, because most of the market participants will choose not to do it. Yeah, so start with simple and mandatory.
I know we're short on time, but one last question. After so many decades of work, what is your dream for the future?
Now, in fact, there's a connection between impact investing, philanthropies and the larger landscape of sustainable finance. A lot of smaller projects which are funded by impact investors may eventually grow to scale, and then they can be financed by big banks and the capital markets and so on. So how do we start this? I think philanthropies can invest in pre-feasibility study to enable these projects to become more bankable. And that's a role, I think, on the earliest stage of larger scale green sustainable projects can be initiated by impact investing.
Okay, I'll let you run. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.